All right. Eric, please go ahead and unmute yourself.
Done.
Okay. All right. So welcome everybody to this, our second event of the semester in our civility series project, which is a project that's going to go on fall. I'm very pleased today to welcome a special speaker to the CUA community and to our class on race and religion. Today, we're joined today by Eric Thomas Weber, and he is Director of Graduate Studies and a Professor of Educational Policy Studies and Evaluation at the University of Kentucky, where I think he's also affiliated with the Department of Philosophy. Certainly, he has some philosophical credentials as well. He has been for quite some time the Executive Director of the Society of Philosophers in America, also known as SOPAN. He won a teaching award a couple of years ago, the University of Kentucky Alumni Association Great Teacher Award. And before coming to the University of Kentucky, he taught for a number of years public policy leadership at the University of Mississippi. He writes and lectures widely. We were lucky he squeezed us into his active lecture series this spring. He writes on democracy, ethics, leadership, education, and culture. And he's edited before a book, collection of essays titled America's Public Philosopher, with works from John Dewey. So he's inspired, I think we may hear a little bit about that today, by the great American philosopher John Dewey. We have a number of elementary education students in this class, so I think they'll especially appreciate having you with us today, Eric. Eric is talking to us today about his new book, just out this year, called A Culture of Justice. So we'll give you some time to introduce the book. I'll follow up with a couple of questions, and then we'll open things up to the audience, both here and online. So please, Eric, let me just make sure that we're enabled sharing here.
Excellent.
Give me a sec.
Let's see if this works.
It should be good.
So far, I'm getting a message that says sharing is not turned on, but I'll send a request.
Okay. Got it.
There we go. Excuse me. Well, but before I share my screen, I'm going to just say thank you so much to Dr. Barbieri, and thank you all for being here. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you about the book. This is a project that was about 13 years in the making. And when you do this amount of work and you're concerned about things of importance to you, you want to talk to people about it. You want to see if it's of any value to people, as well as get people's thoughts, feedback, and criticism, because that helps for next steps in terms of thinking about how could I improve either on my project or perhaps learn for the next one. So that said, thank you all for having me here. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And the good news is that any of you who want to have access to anything that's on the screen, you can point your cell phone camera at the QR code in the top right of the screen. It's not always on the top right. I had to move it a couple of times for some slides just because I'm using some pictures. But I am Eric Weber. The book is called A Culture of Justice. And I want to add that in talking about this with various people and at different times, what's nice is sort of thinking about different aspects of the project. And there's something I think special about, speaking with the Catholic University of America, which is that part of one of the questions that motivates my book has to do with university creeds. A creed is a religious term, and the two major universities I've worked at, each for about a decade, have university creeds. And so I want to talk to you about that today a little bit as one of the examples of the ways to think about a culture of justice. So also, of course, you've got, if you want to find out more about me, here's a webpage and my Facebook link. I have other stuff too, but you can find all those on my webpage if you wish. So thank you again for having me here. Oh, at the top, I've got this link. If you don't use a QR code, bit.ly is a way to have short links. And then CUA, and then today's date is the short link if you want to be able to access this file without your camera on your cell phone. So let's go ahead and move in. I'm going to talk first about culture and conflict, right? Because we have all kinds of conflicts all the time, and culture is something that can seem sort of like related to museums or high culture, as sometimes people refer to it. But it's also the big picture notion in the background about. Well, I'll come to my definition of it in a little bit, but here's an example of a kind of worry about American culture at the moment, based on a piece that was published recently by Amnesty International. And again, if you want to get more information about this, follow this QR code, and then you can click on the link to learn more about what has been called White Supremacy's Comeback Tour by Amnesty International, which is saying that the United States is presently facing a human rights crisis. Now, I'm not saying you have to agree with this, but this is the moral assessment of people in the world to looking at us and thinking about what we're doing. And similarly, there was a global report referring to the idea that democracy in the United States is being quote unquote dismantled at an unprecedented speed. Not everybody is upset about how things are going right now, but this is again an indication of people's worries about culture. And then we've heard words recently, as you may know, from the Pope about the conflict in Iran and problems with how we've come into this and what we've already done, let alone have threatened. And so I'm bringing up something a little bit smaller in a sense, insofar as it's in the United States. But there was this message not long ago posted by our president that the greatest enemy America has, he said, is the radical left, the Democrat Party, he says. And again, you can follow this link to read more about where he says this. But the point is that, you know, for a very long time, right and left have thought about the importance of unity, right? And when I say for a very long time, my goodness, going all the way back to Plato's Republic, right? Here's an important line from Book 5 of Plato's Republic. The great philosopher writes, it's a question, of course. Um, is there any greater evil we can mention for a city than that which tears it apart and makes it many instead of one? Or any greater good than that which binds it together and makes it one? The idea is when you get too far sort of separated, when you get too far divided, well, you end up with, you know, two different societies, right? So many churches, you know, have disagreements that then result in, you know, the Reformed church of so on versus the traditional church of so on. So, you know, not just about church, but societies, cities, countries can be highly divided. And I like to remind people that the very first word in the name of this country is united. It's supposed to be a crucial and important notion. And when one serves in public office, you may be elected by your base, but the presumption is usually that you're supposed to be serving for the benefit of all and to think we're on the same team. Now, right and left can be thinking of each other as enemies. I know that. And my point is not to only criticize one point of view, but rather the point about division of great extremes, calling another group of members of your own country the enemy, well, that's kind of revolutionary language. That's violent rhetoric. But I want to back up and come to something gentler and more fragile in a way, or perhaps what people think is much less consequential. So what I've spoken about just a moment ago was a couple of matters of American norms that are changing in the culture. But there are also ways in which culture can be much more subtle. And I think people understand, of course, we understand that things like courts, right, and prisons and policing and so on, you know, these are ways in which society can contribute, for better or worse, to justice. We know that about our institutions, but part of what I'm saying in this book is that we want to not only think about institutions, we want to not only think about things like actual court trials, whatever, although those are important for thinking about culture. I want to show the continuity of problems for justice between that and all the way to things that are symbols, right? And so this is where this book comes from. I put the picture down here because I wanted to put this flag up here on the right. What you're seeing now on the screen is the former flag of the state of Mississippi. I was told at least 100 times when I lived in Mississippi, that we're never going to change that flag, people said to me. And today there is a different flag. It's the Magnolia flag. You're welcome to look it up. I didn't post that, but the point is that we do have a different flag today, and maybe it doesn't matter. When I was talking with students at the University of Mississippi about a conflict at the time about the state flag, this was the state flag. Students asked me, "Why does a flag matter?" It's a piece of cloth. It's a something draped. Right. It's a symbol. That's all it is, right? Well, in the state flag, you might think this is the Confederate flag. This is the state flag of Mississippi, the former one, and in the canton is what we call the Confederate battle flag emblem. And in fact, the horizontal stripes are also from one of the former Confederate flags as well. But it's sort of a mixture of two different Confederate flags to get this one for the state of Mississippi. Why does a flag matter for justice? Well, when I was talking with students about this, they were sort of really kind of not concerned about it. They didn't see why it mattered until we heard that the university calling for the flag to come down resulted in a planned protest of the Ku Klux Klan to come to campus. They were not happy to hear about the flag coming down at the University of Mississippi. Now, interestingly, in the state of Mississippi, it's the law that state institutions, buildings, are supposed to fly the flag on their grounds. What the Klan didn't worry about, however, is the fact that for over a dozen years before this, maybe 15 years, the historically black colleges in the University of Mississippi, those did they had already taken down the state flags and not flown them, and nobody sort of criticized or said anything about it. When the predominantly white institution in the state in Mississippi called for taking the flag down, that drew the ire. That drew the ire of the Klan and critics. So, in a short amount of time, student leaders, as Dr. Barbieri mentioned, I was a professor in the Department of Public Policy Leadership. Well, we had these great, ambitious, talented, strong, smart students, and they in 3 days' time found the money and made 500 T-shirts that read "Turn Your Back on Hate." And it may be hard for you to read this. Again, you can get the file with this QR code and zoom in if you wish. On the bottom of the shirt, you may be able to see that it says, "I live by the UM Creed." The students at the University of Mississippi thought it wise. By the way, this is not a new T-shirt concept, right? Turn your back on hate, others have thought of as well. But the addition at the bottom of "I live by the UM Creed" was a statement by students calling attention to shared values that they held with the creed of the University of Mississippi. And what you can see in this man's hand in the front of this picture is a copy of the creed, and we're going to come to that in just a moment. By the way, in case you're curious or interested, actually you can see me in this picture right here. If you look at me from the side, you can tell that's me. My students had organized this. It was amazing, and this is a small picture. There were more pictures. I just found the one for this purpose, but it was a significant response. And so one of the ways that I'll talk about that I have talked about in this book of combating some of the messages and problems that come from hateful speech and expression and efforts is to speak in turn, is to speak up and counter protest and to call for what's right. This is one of the elements of fighting for a culture of justice that I'll come back to. But so, here you have the UM Creed, okay? The University of Mississippi is a community of learning dedicated to nurturing excellence in intellectual inquiry and personal character in an open and diverse environment. As a voluntary member of this community, in other words, I don't have to be here, you don't have to have me here, whatever. I believe in respect for the dignity of each person. That line was emphasized loud and proud as the protesters, with their backs towards the Ku Klux Klan, "Turn your back on hate" was the sign on the T-shirt. We were reading this over and over again, the whole thing, but emphasizing, "I believe in respect for the dignity of each person." Right? We read all these things together. My point is that we have here a crucial expression of a value that the University of Mississippi claims is central to what it means to be a member of the university community. Okay? Now, in the tradition of political philosophy, what we refer to as political liberalism is not as simple as the idea that this person's conservative and that person's liberal, that you may already be familiar, but the notion of liberalism fundamentally is an idea about the justification of government and its roots in liberty of the individual, which means that I should consent to what it is you're doing. In other words, the consent of the governed is crucial. And you can hear it, familiarly in notions like, don't tread on me. If you're familiar with the coiled snake on the yellow flag, right? Don't tread on me. In other words, if you do things that are going to step on me without my consent, hey, watch out, right? The snake bites. And so, one of the points to draw from the consent of the governed and political liberalism is that there needs to be a significant emphasis on minimizing unnecessary interference into people's lives and culture. Right? You don't want people. If you like the idea of smaller government, you like the idea of minimizing interference into people's lives. If you like the idea of freedom and it's important to you and equality, right? You don't want people to, bulldoze you with their priorities. So there is an important norm here, and a question essentially is, should a public university even have a creed? Right? Because one could say, hey, I'm a taxpayer. I don't agree to all these things in the creed. I want to go to college. Why do I have to accept this stuff? Right? You could say that a creed might interfere with someone who doesn't believe in respect for the dignity of each person. What is a university creed for? Not every university has a creed, of course, but we all do have sort of statements of expectations for students' behavior. And at the University of Kentucky, we have or had, I'm not entirely sure exactly how to express this, a creed. This plaque, the University of Kentucky Creed, is a document that is that is published and on a stand right outside of the most, well, I don't know if it's the most important, but it's called the main building on campus at the University of Kentucky. And if you'll notice on the third little answer to the question, well, as a Wildcat, what will you do? I promise, it says, to embrace diversity and inclusion and to respect the dignity and humanity of others. This is a statement of values in the Creed of the University of Kentucky, and it was adopted in March of 2013. Now, in the last 2 years, or last year, I guess it was the last year, the Kentucky passed a law, right, about DEI matters. The creed is no longer on the University of Kentucky's website. Presumably, the reason is about that line, embrace the diversity and inclusion and respect for the dignity and humanity of others. This is a document that members of the University of Kentucky created and shared and adopted for the sake of expressing their values, in part for the guidance of student conduct, because it was on the student code of conduct page. One way to think about creeds is to consider the idea that in what we do in education, there are always values underlying our task. Historically, people who were professors were professing the faith, of course, right? But when you're talking about a public institution where no one is necessarily expected to have to be religious, well, in those contexts, you might say, well, should you have a creed? And one could say no, because you think, oh my gosh, as a public institution, we shouldn't be intruding on people's culture. But you can also say yes, insofar as, well, the educational endeavor requires certain tasks and values in order to do this for the public, and therefore we need to express those values and expect people to live up to them. That's another way of thinking, right? Now, I haven't finished it yet, but I've begun writing an op-ed about this, referring to it as the Creedless University, because we had one and we've removed it. Now, the plaque is still there, admittedly. But at the end of the day, it's a reasonable question. What does it mean? Does it mean anything? Does it mean nothing, or is it important? Right? These are the kinds of questions I want to raise and have you consider with me. Now, when I say all this in the context of my book called A Culture of Justice, it's reasonable to ask, well, what are you talking about, Weber, in regard to that? I'm trying to present ways of thinking about how we meet culture? Where is it and how and what does it look like and so forth? And the answer is in so many ways, of course. But with the definition, the one that I've adopted is a Eric Weber sort of a simplification of what you get from the introduction. I guess technically it's the foreword to Ruth Benedict's book called Patterns of Culture, and the foreword was written by Margaret Mead. And my mine is essentially an approximation of what Margaret Mead says. With that culture is the set of symbols, languages, because it's not always one, beliefs, practices, and institutions transmitted from one generation to the next. It's a set, kind of like in a mathematical set. It includes many things, right? But sets also can overlap, right? And so that's one of the things to consider. But I've mentioned already, and I'm going to repeat it, the idea that political liberalism, again, generally aims to avoid or minimize intrusion into people's lives and culture, taking the norm of consent of the governed to be of paramount importance. But let me give you an example of a problem. The problem is essentially that people's engagement with the wider culture, or another way of saying it is their exercise of their own culture, can cause harm to others in a variety of ways, or at least sometimes make one appear unfit to hold public obligations. So here's an example. This man was an EMT worker, emergency medical technician for Regional One Health of Memphis, Tennessee. You may not be able to see this very well, so in this case, I have blown up the picture. On his shirt is not just the Confederate battle flag, but also another symbol, the noose. The noose is a symbol of murder and of threat and of racial violence. Although, of course, anybody can be killed with a noose. There is a history and a context. Now, this man was fired, as you can see from the headline, for wearing a t-shirt. Now, being fired for wearing a t-shirt sounds implausible. What do you mean? A person on his own time goes out, wears a t-shirt. What does that have to do with his employment? And in fact, a scholar with whom I respect deeply believes that if this man were a pizza deliverer, she thinks that he could probably exercise his functions without problem. You got to go to the place and hand someone the pizza and collect the money, and you could do that whether or not you like who you're handing it to or not, what have you. But this person was an emergency medical technician. This is someone who shows up when there's an emergency or a problem, and there's various people who may need to be treated, triaged, and taken to a hospital. Regional One Health put out a press release saying that the values expressed in the wearing of this shirt are in clear conflict with the values necessary for the fair performance of an EMT's duties. This man lost his job as a result. Some people think you shouldn't lose your job for what t-shirt you wear, although I haven't heard much conflict over this case. The other thing to say is, let's say there weren't a noose there. Let's say there were not a noose on the t-shirt, right? Come on, the Confederacy was about states' rights, we've heard a million times, right? It's not about racism. It's about pride. It's about the people who lost their lives to defend their state, right? Well, keep in mind that the people saying this to me for a decade were in Mississippi. And the wonderful thing is that Mississippians proclaim a care and value for culture and history. So we should look at that. In the top right of the screen is a QR code for the whole PowerPoint that you can download. The other QR code that says scan me is to a link to the scan of the document on the left, which is Mississippi's declaration of its cause for secession, right? And in that document, we have a very clear and explicit first sentence answering the question: in the momentous step in which our state has taken of dissolving its connection with the government of which it so long formed a part, it is but just that we should declare the prominent reasons which have induced our course. What's the answer? The first answer: our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest of the world. Its labor supplies the product, which constitutes by far the largest and most important portions of the commerce of the earth. These products are peculiar to the climate verging on the tropical regions, and by an imperious law of nature, none but the black race can bear exposure to the tropical sun. You can read the rest of the document. I would bring this to my classes at the University of Mississippi, and one day, I heard a student say "awkward" because the name of her great great grandfather was in one of the signatories on the third page. And she's a lovely person, by the way, but she acknowledges the problems of the state's past. But anyway, so you can say that to you something means what it does to you, but we can also talk about ways of thinking about how that affects others, and we'll come to that in a moment. So at the end of the day, the man who's just wearing a t-shirt somewhere, you might say, who's he affecting and why? It's just, as I said, it's a piece of cloth. But pieces of cloth can convey threats, especially, for instance, one that features a noose. Here's a line directly from the book. One of the reviewers of the book liked it, so I'm emphasizing it. Like in a fish tank, the cultural environment of the water is one in which we all swim. Right? So you got to think about what kind of culture do you want your children to grow up in? Because it can look like the pretty one here, or it can look different and far less healthy, murkier and problematic. And I have an illustration for you, which is in philosophy in general, when you want to demonstrate something, when you want to make your point, how it is instantiated, how you make an example of it, right? Makes all the difference in my view. And so here's an example to try and render very concretely why might anyone care about a flag, right? It's a piece of cloth, right? Well, the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, went before the Louisiana Supreme Court in 2011 and had the following question. Can a black defendant in a death row case expect a fair trial in a courthouse over which the Confederate battle flag is flying? The Supreme Court of Louisiana is not a bastion of liberalism, which I say tongue in cheek. My point, though, is that this is their response. The Supreme Court of Louisiana said it is not unreasonable for a person viewing another featuring a Confederate battle flag to imagine that they harbor racist sentiments. That was an approximation of what they said, very close to what they said. And the Caddo Parish is where that particular case was about, voted by 11-1 to take down the flag. So of course I had to track down what did that one person say? It was a guy. What did that one guy say? And he was talking about how, we'll be sued by the Daughters of the Confederacy or the Sons of Confederate Veterans, and that was the kind of language of he was worried about a lawsuit, and there hasn't been one. But that said, that wasn't about why the flag is a good thing or why it's so bad. Anyway, there is a cost, a risk that someone could sue you, but that doesn't mean they'll win. And sometimes you got to do what's right, whether or not someone will sue you. They can try, but if you're right, hopefully it's defensible. So, what I've done so far is to lead you into the notion of thinking about, first of all, why might someone care about a given cultural matter? And my example for today is the university creed, right? And I wanted to sort of give you a sense of the scope and kind of sphere in which my argument is being presented, so that now I can present to you this argument. Dr. Barbieri, do we have time for the extended, or do you want a shorter version of it?
Let's do the shorter version so we can open it up.
Short version. Here we go. So I'm glad I included another slide on that. So here is the short version. You can read the longer version when you on your time. The short version is essentially that culture can inhibit the pursuit of justice, and people can be harmed or set back by cultural means. Therefore, there's a shared public obligation to establish and maintain a culture that maximally fosters self-respect in all people and a sense of their own positive power to pursue meaningful life plans. If you're wondering about that ending part, I can explain more about that. But the short version is there's a shared public obligation to establish and maintain a culture of justice. Now, one of the features of among the premises is the idea that the responsibility and ability to affect culture for us is shared among all of us and our institutions. Correspondingly, it is a shared public obligation. And so just because kind of everybody has an obligation doesn't mean no one in particular does, which is one of the challenges people face. If it's everybody's responsibility, then it isn't mine. Someone else will do it. No, no, no. It's everybody's responsibility. Okay. So when you ask the question, should a public university have a creed? Well, I'm not saying that everyone should have one, but it is something clearly, to my mind, defensible. The government does speak, which is one of the outcomes of certain Supreme Court cases, and we get to choose what it should say, right? And among other things, for instance, the idea that we should promote respect for the dignity and worth of each person, right? And be concerned about things like diversity and its consequences and challenges, and think about the importance of including everyone, which we have to do for disability law, let alone for any other purpose. So at the end of the day, Eric Weber's point of view is that a university creed is an opportunity for a public institution to express its moral values necessary for the fulfillment of its obligations. And as such, I think that's a profoundly important document that can be of great value and is at the very least certainly defensible, in my view, for institutions to have when they write them responsibly for the sake of a culture of justice. So, thank you so much for the chance to present these things to you. I welcome your thoughts and challenges. And just so you know, if you wish, the academic books are very expensive in hardbacks for libraries because they're archival and they're acid-free paper, etc. But there's now a paperback version of the book coming out in July, and there's a discount code of 30% off with that code there if you want. And you got to use the website, the publisher's website for that. But all that said, I want to hear what your thoughts are, your challenges, your questions, and I look forward to them. And I really appreciate challenges because they help me make my ideas better and to think about the next steps. So thank you very much.
All right, let's hear it. First of all, let me invite people who are on the Zoom call, if they would like to pose a question, maybe put it in the chat. If you can, we'll consult that in a bit. I want to kick things off with a couple of questions of my own, but we also want to hear from the students and others in this room. So again, thank you. I think the example of using a university setting really brings some of these questions home. But I wonder, very broadly, a lot of your book is about what we might think of as free speech issues, or what are debated as free speech issues. So I wonder how you would describe your principled approach to describing or to distinguishing between speech that you think goes beyond the pale. In the thesis of your book, in a sentence, is that culture can inhibit or enable the pursuit of justice. And presumably when culture inhibits the pursuit of justice, then as a community, we need to take measures that might involve restricting it. So what would the principal basis be for distinguishing between acceptable speech and maybe when we've gone beyond tolerable speech?
Excellent. And thank you so much for the great question. There's no question in my mind that speech is one of the most challenging sorts of problems for this purpose. And I give a chapter to that, therefore. And there's an interesting parallel. I use an analogy in order to answer your question, because we already have something else that's against the law, but that gets defended as free speech, but not always. And in particular, I'm thinking of sedition. Sedition is effectively, planning to overthrow the government, or speech to overthrow the government if it's seditious speech, right? And it's illegal to try and overthrow the government. In fact, seditious speech is by statute illegal, but by Supreme Court decision defended under conditions. What's the key condition? The key condition, is really ironic, is that if you're ineffectual, if you're not convincing anyone, if you're not moving the needle to get people to change their minds and join you and overthrow the government, the speech is defended. But as soon as you start getting traction, as soon as you start getting people to join your cause and to enlist and deepen your plans to overthrow the government, the government stops you at that point, which is a really funny notion. And if you're achieving what you mean to, you don't get to do it. But if you're not achieving what you mean to, you do, which is the strangest notion. Combine that with another thing. At the University of Mississippi, there was a noose incident The picture I showed you wasn't at the university. That was at a polling booth, a polling station. But at the University of Mississippi, three freshmen in 2014 put a noose and an old Georgia flag around the statue to James Meredith. The old Georgia flag, two-thirds of it is the Confederate battle flag emblem with a blue part on the other side. And James Meredith was the man who integrated the University of Mississippi. And my point is that these men draped that noose over the statue and the flag, and they got prison time. Now it was first of all it's for a threat. So we already have policy that can limit speech when it's involving threats. That's already on the books and successful. Now, not all speech involves threats, of course. So, but at the very least, there's one place to begin, is to say when speech involves threats, we already have mechanisms to limit that speech and to punish, in fact, that speech. See, some advocates for political liberalism I know have told me that they just thought those guys had a bad lawyer. My own view is hopeful that in fact that's not only the case, is that perhaps they would have gotten a worse sentence if they had an even worse lawyer. But what's fundamentally the difference? And here's the interesting thing: the attorneys for the young men, for the men who draped the noose and flag, argued that the fraternity that these guys were members of had engaged in cultivating hatred. I bring this up because the word cultivation is the key. There's a wonderful essay by John Dewey in which he talks about the basic loyalties of democracy, and the most fundamental, he says, is to communication. But then he goes on in the same essay to say it's strange how many people feel free to express and cultivate hatred. But he just said that you're free to express maximally. But what's the difference? And cultivate. What does the cultivation mean? That means you are effectively advancing the cause of hatred, which he calls treason to democracy. And so, if you're simply studying, say, the Klan, or if a person of color called me a cracker, or if whatever, those kinds of things are not hate speech. They're not cultivation of hatred, right? But and when we're talking in a history class about what, say, the Klan did, or in this presentation about that, the intent is the opposite of the cultivation of hatred, right? The intent is greater understanding, right? And we have to know our history. We shouldn't bury and just destroy things like, Confederate statues and so forth. But we have museums and we have graveyards that are perhaps more appropriate places for them. And so the key difference I would make is not mere expression, but cultivation, which effectively has to be talking about the ways in which the cause is advanced beyond mere expression.
Let me just push you on that a little bit, because the sedition example you gave, the test is what is the effect of the speech? It's not what the intent is. If you're talking about whether speech cultivates an environment that undermines people's self-respect and power and so on, is the intent key to cultivate it, or is it the fact that they succeed in cultivating a hostile environment?
That's interesting. Eric Weber's point of view thinks that intent matters, but if the effect were the key, and that's a policy mechanism. Although why it should be one way or another is a philosophical question. I completely agree with you on that. So look, my argument actually is in favor of the control to some degree of cultivation. At the same time, I do understand the context of the United States being so different from other countries that while I have one argument that I think actually the Robot plan of action is not a bad way of thinking about addressing hate speech, I also recognize that in this country we've got a lot of various reasons why people are sort of more extremists or purists, if you will, for the defense of speech, which is why in my chapter on speech, I want to acknowledge that the reality of it. And therefore, given that if we weren't able to make further changes, that the important thing, I haven't read other people argue. I think this is novel, and I've been told it is that the obligation isn't over just when you're talking about trying to whether or not someone should be allowed to speak. Because when the Klan did come to campus, there was another means of combating unjust cultures, which is to respond, right? In other words, to have a counter protest, as the students did. There's another example, actually, beyond the one I gave you of the T-shirts. At Texas A&M University, there was an instance whereby a family was going to, at the cemetery, of course, bury a veteran, a soldier who had died. And you may be familiar with the Westboro Baptist Church. This is a group that goes around to funerals to engage in protests to say that the United States is losing soldiers like these because of our policies about things like LGBTQ plus persons. And so the folks in Texas, they didn't like the idea of having that kind of protest at the funeral of a veteran, and so there was a locked arms protest in response, whereby members of the student community stood in locked arms in a long wall that surrounded the event. And while the expression of the Westboro Baptist Church folks was still permitted to go on, there was a significant human barrier that enabled privacy and quiet, and was a non-speech limiting way of combating unjust speech. So
Okay.
yeah.
Good. I've got one more question for you, and then we're gonna open things up. We've got a couple of questions from the online queue here. Here's my question. It's a two-parter. Um, Catholic University, as you know, is a faith-based university. It's the National University of the Catholic Church. And one of the big concerns here is with religious liberty. Now, you mentioned in the introduction to your book that I read that one of the problems you're concerned with, ways in which a culture that undermines justice can be created, involves religious attacks on self-respect. I wonder what you meant by that, or are you thinking about what Baptist Church? Are you thinking about Masterpiece Cake Shop? What do you see as problematic religious speech? And then the related question is, your presentation addresses what the approach should be at a public university. How do you think a public university is different from a private or religious university?
Excellent questions. Thank you for those. So I guess I could give you probably two or three quick examples of what I mean, and forgive me if the first one sounds facile, but I don't intend it to be. The Ku Klux Klan, it thinks of itself as a religious organization. I'm not saying you should think that's Christianity. I get that point. But what I'm trying to tell you is, why do they use crosses? They'll tell you if you read their websites that it's a Christian organization. So there are ways in which one can make use of one's religion for things like attacks with regard to racism. But another would be, now this one's a little more complicated, but there is a regular publication, or there's certain articles that come out every so often on what is referred to as religion motivated medical neglect. Each year, well, at least in the given year of the article I most recently read, it was about 200,000 people. I don't want to tell you wrong. I don't remember the scope at the time. I'd have to look at it again, but it's been a while since I've thought of this example. The point is that if a kid has a pneumonia and is taken to the hospital but has Jehovah's Witness parents, it may be, that's not the only necessary group, but it may be that people might have life-saving treatment denied. And then, look, when a person shows up to school bruised and bloodied, whatever religious view you hold, you could say, "Hey, I followed Scripture. I'm supposed to get a stick no thicker than my thumb, etc." I can give you lots of reasons why my kid has these bruises, right? The person who spares the child hates him, is the passage from the Bible, right? My point is that you can show up to school beaten and bloodied, and the Child Protective Services will step in. But if a kid shows up to the hospital with a deadly pneumonia, the parent can just say, "No, I don't want treatment," and then the kid's dead. So I think we have to think about the ways in which we value the possibility of denying life-saving treatment over the freedom to not spare the child, right? Or not spoil the child, excuse me, right? In other words, it's more important anyway. So that's one more example. Others would be things like, for instance, um, uh, rules about what possibilities women can have in a life, right? Where you can't do a whole bunch of things, right? And so there are ways in societies in which people can be very happy with this and pursue great lives, but there are also cases, for instance, where you might forego options for your life for a set of religious reasons that you wish you didn't have to, right? And so there are. This is an area of controversy. I'm not picking a particular, but that's a kind, right? So those are a couple of the ways I'm thinking about this. When people make use of religion for the sake of diminishing a person's sense of their own positive power, that's effectively the question in the test. Yeah.
Any quick comment about public versus private?
Oh, yes, yes. Thank you so much for that. Yeah, so actually, I think the idea of a creed at a university is much more controversial at a public university. Um, now, a good friend of mine and the scholar who literally wrote the book on the history of American higher education, John Thielen, he was my senior mentor in the department before he retired. He he would say that there's not much of a difference between a public and a private institution, especially because all of them take a whole bunch of government money. There are very few exceptions that don't, right? And that money might be given to the institution or it could be given to the student to spend at the institution. But he doesn't seem all that much of a difference compared to me, where I still see, look, you know, you can't have a certain kind of public religious institution, so it's got to be a private one. And obviously, we're going to have certain sorts of differences. But again, what I would say is that I think, especially honestly, a Catholic university, I think has as centrally in its mission the intent to inculcate and defend ethics, right? When I was interviewed at the University of St. Thomas many years ago, I enjoyed thinking about and talking about the cardinal virtues, which are very much what you see in Plato's Republic, right? Which are at the heart of what those institutions say they're aiming to do and value.
Yeah, there you go. I noticed that the line you pointed to in the UK creed mentioned dignity, and that's a very central notion here.
Indeed.
All
Indeed.
right,
And love being crucial, obviously. Love is one of the things I think you could see as motivating many of these values.
very
May I
good.
ask a quick? Um,
Let's see. Well, I have Lua Yunin had checked in to pose a question.
Thanks, Beer. May I ask a question?
Yes, please go ahead.
Thanks, Beer, and thanks, Professor Eric Webb. I noticed that your new book, A Culture of Justice, has just been published this year. Thanks, Beer, and thanks, Professor Eric. It's a great honor to have the opportunity to listen to this event. I quite agree with your statements. I have a small question that has been puzzling me. Perhaps it is somewhat off topic. President Trump's action have affected the image of the United States in our hearts. Given that some countries are currently in a state of war, how can a just peace be possible? How should we critically read Kantor's proponent to peace and rules the law of peoples, and how can philosophical scholars translate academic justice into the political realm? I'm sorry. Maybe it's not easy to
Thank you.
answer this question. Thank you.
These are wonderful questions. Very nice. The quick answer is that culture is something we work on at all levels, right? When you teach a kid how to count, right? With my kids, we had books like, Five Monkeys Jumping on a Bed. But when I was a kid, we had books about 10 Little Indians. A generation before, there was a book called 10 Little N-Word Boys. And if you search it, you can find it sung to music on YouTube. It's really disturbing. And in the story, a boy dies in each page, right? Until you get to the end, and he doesn't die, but he's no longer a boy because he has a relationship and becomes a man, which of course sexualizes him. So there are ways in which, at all the levels, from the government dropping bombs to we're teaching our kids to read, there is a consistency between these. And I'm coming to your point ultimately, but what I'm trying to get at is that I actually originally found it really weird in Plato's Republic when he had rules about what modes of music you could reasonably play in. I mean, he's very extreme in his control. And if you're any of you who are musicians are familiar with the Phrygian, the Ionian, the Dorian, these are modes of music depending on which key on the keyboard you start on and play 8 notes, right? The octave. Anyway, my point is that there is a continuity between matters of culture and symbols and sort of our institutions and our practices. These things are related to each other. And so, what I'm trying to get at is that there are elements of combating bigger picture issues that are up and down. The question is, how fast are we trying to emphasize things? For example, Richard Rorty, a great philosopher who's passed away now, wrote a piece about human rights, rationality, and sentimentality. And he was talking in that essay about how he thinks we should combat the attacks on human rights in places, for instance, where women aren't given opportunity. And his answer was that the spread of literature is one of the crucial things needed in order to foster a healthy set of emotions, what he called sentimental education. So Rorty thought the spread of literature throughout certain countries might do a lot to enable people to see from someone else's perspective, to have greater sympathy, empathy, what have you, right? And understanding of others and of difference. So now that is a very slow way to combat human rights. It's not immediate. So if you're thinking about a famine and people are starving now, well, something about resources or food is going to be essential and needs to be prompt. But we don't want to forget that when there are sudden problems like now, there's also continuing problems. We have to think about sort of the long game too. The person who is wise who plants a tree under whose shade he'll never sit, right? Like you have to think about the future as well. And so you have to think about the short term and the long term game. And as far as what you do in the short term, well, there's so many actions people have been trying and taking. People who have access to courts have been suing. We all have ways we can call a congressperson if you're in the United States, and so you can call representatives, you can protest, you can write, you can publish, you can also talk to your neighbor. Because think about one of the things that is having an impact. Polls are having an impact, right? Because people are not listening sometimes to directives if they think, oh my gosh, in a few months I've got to run for office and I need to be reelected if I'm going to do any of these other things on my agenda, right? And so people have to pay attention to those. And that may be small, but it is something. We can also, where we can, who can give money to organizations that help diminish suffering, that help support other people. We can vote for policies and priorities that we think promote the good and the sense of self-respect and of positive power for all people. And I think honestly, we laugh about folks who just scroll and say things on social media, but we have more power today than ever before to engage in communication with people we know. But so do hateful folks. So it is not nothing to speak up and to talk to your friends and peers and so on, Facebook, wherever. It's not nothing to contribute to those dialogues and to say this isn't okay, right? Or we should have certain kinds of expectations. Or, what's on the Supreme Court Justice Building? Equal justice for all. Should that be removed because it's DEI? I hope not.
Okay. All right. Let me get a question or two from the room. Yes, Jayla.
I want to start off by saying thank you so much for being here and speaking with us. My question is what do you identify as the like significant difference or differences between a creed and a mission and vision statement, and which would you identify as having more of like a powerful influence on communicating the spiritual and racial sentiments of the university? Thank you so much.
Well, first of all, that was an incredibly kind opening, and then secondly, wow, that's a heck of a question. Excellent question. And until now, I had not thought about the relationship between a university creed and an institution's mission and values statement. Um, I guess I would think between those, I would think the values statement would be closer to a university creed. Um, that's really interesting. I guess what I think I would say is to invoke some Charles Peirce. As Dr. Barbieri mentioned, I'm someone influenced and inspired by John Dewey. Well, John Dewey was hugely inspired by the American genius known as Charles Peirce. He was a problematic figure in some ways, interesting guy, but he was such a genius that he couldn't hold a normal career. He really struggled with that. He couldn't put up with people very well. It was one of his problems. But he was also very smart. And what he said, Peirce said, is that the meaning of a concept can be understood in terms of its practical consequences, right? And so William James, was influenced by this as well, talking about, anyone who's familiar with pragmatism, you may remember the talk about, when you go around a tree that has a squirrel on it, and you know how the squirrel stays on the opposite side. Have you gone around the squirrel? You've gone to the north, to the east, to the south, to whatever. You've gone around it geographically, right? Northeast, southwest, whatever. But you haven't gone to the side and back of the squirrel, right? When I go around a car, I go to the front, to the side, to the back, and the side and the front. So the point is, your purposes for how you define something matter. Because if you're a boxer, you don't geographically want to get around the other boxer. You want to get to the other boxer's side, right? Whereas if you're thinking in terms of maps, you're trying to go geographically. So my point is, what is the purpose of a university's values statement? I want to say that I think that a mission and value statement usually has to do with something like a strategic plan and its implementation, right? So you all are in a given university setting. Every so many years, another administrator comes along and says, we need a strategic plan. And it tires people out when you make a plan and nothing really comes of it very specifically. But sometimes they can be useful and very successful. But my point is that for the sake of a plan for a given institution, you want to think about who are we trying to become? How do we position ourselves? What are the values we have in this area, in this place, right? Kentucky is a big place for horses, right? So don't be surprised if our institutions have, in our agricultural program, we have an equestrian specialty, right? That's that's going to be related to our values, which relate to who we are and what we can offer, etc. Now, what it is you are as an intellectual institution is not just about kind of the values of this particular space and how you might have certain great opportunities, etc. It's more about the educational endeavor as a whole, I guess I would suggest. Could they be sometimes the same kind of thing, maybe a value statement being a creed? Possibly, but I guess the difference would be the purpose for which each was created. And so when you think about University of Kentucky's example, again, that was a creed that was adopted on the Student Code of Conduct webpage, and of course they put a plaque as well. So in a sense, that was a statement about the values of what we expect from people in terms of their behavior as voluntary members of the institution. Whereas the values statement that you might get alongside a mission statement might be something more along the lines of the unique peculiarities of, say, the University of Kentucky, what have you, and how the limestone in the ground has made horses, etc. Have stronger bones, and but what we're going to bring excellence to equestrian, this and that, and so again, I guess I would think mainly about the purpose. Yeah.
Okay, good. I'll take one more from in here, and then we're going to combine a couple of questions from chat. I hope you can stay on a couple of minutes.
Sure.
All right.
Just to re-echo, thanks for being here. We really appreciate the time you took out your day to be with us. One question I had is regarding you bringing up sedition in your presentation, and how it can significantly impact this vision for a culture of justice. So my question is, and it might be a controversial question depending on how one interprets it. Do you think that this vision of having a culture of justice, do you think that that has been affected by the events of January 6th in 2021?
I'm sorry, do I think what has been affected by January 6, 2021?
This vision for a culture of justice.
Interesting. This is something, the answer, at least how I feel about what you're asking, is something I think I've developed just in the last few months. Because of emphasis on the consent of the governed language, right? Essentially, January 6th had to do with reluctance to fulfill the tasks for the peaceful transfer of power. And what I've been seeing lately may not be any different from the past, but it might be. I don't know. You all tell me what you think about this. But in talk about the recent SAVE Act, there's something consistent with your point about January 6th, which is that there are predictions, and this is from Senator Murkowski, a Republican senator, who was talking about Alaska. And if a person wanted to go to one of the 6 polling places where you could verify your identity, you might have to spend as much as $1,000. So this was a Republican senator explaining her opposition to the Republican-derived SAVE Act, right? And so the point is that there's a lot of people who won't be able to do that, right? And therefore, this is a kind of voter suppression. Voter suppression is another version, I would say, of the reluctance to follow the rules of the peaceful transfer of power. It's a reluctance to care about a concern for the governed, right? If you really care about wanting smaller government, wanting like certain kinds of ideals, well, but you shouldn't want that against the will of others. You should want to convince others, join me in thinking this is the way to go. Right. But I remember posting, now this is just on Facebook. This is just someone responding. So it's just an experience of one, an anecdote. But I remember posting saying, oh my gosh, voter suppression is wrong. This is a problem. And responses I got were along the lines of, well, that's your opinion and I don't agree. And that tenor is new in my experience. Maybe it's not new. And I think plenty of people out there would be happy to succeed at suppressing the voters that are against their view. There may be people with that, I think, short-sighted view. But the abandonment of some basic fundamental norms is really troubling, because this is something the United States should be proud of. According to Arthur Schlesinger, a historian, he thinks one of the 10 great contributions to civilization of the United States, Schlesinger wrote in, gosh, maybe it was the 50s, I think he wrote this, is the consent of the governed, the importance of that. Of course, we also got to think about, what we learned from France, but that wasn't the point of his article. But in other words, there is something centrally American to the notion that don't tread on me is pointing to the importance of the consent of the governed, which is supposed to mean when you have a vote, well, unless there's clear evidence of a problem, you're supposed to accept what the vote says. And we are experiencing lots of people who favor not accepting that. And when I say a lot of people, I don't know what proportion it is, but again, plenty of people, including Republicans in the Senate, are saying the SAVE Act is going to problematically disable people from voting. And how are you going to have a consent of the governed when you do that? And so that's how I see a connection to the January 6th. It's sort of a lack of acceptance of, and so of course there's a breakdown of trust furthermore too, right? But we do want to check these things. At the same time, as far as I understand and the research I've read, the United States has one of the most transparent and most carefully watched election systems in the world. As far as someone can correct me, and I'd be happy to learn otherwise. But that's my understanding from what I've read. So thank you again for the very nice question, by the way.
One last question. We have some philosophers online, I think, so this goes in a more philosophical direction. But if you look at those questions in the chat, they're both asking something similar about to what degree a culture of justice can be pluralistic or can encompass rather different understandings of justice. Should a democratic culture of justice exclude other cultures of justice, or should it allow conflicting interpretations of justice? Can two truths coexist? You seem to be kind of optimistic about the potential for rationally working out all differences in the book. So I wonder how much your approach to culture of justice leaves open the idea that there might be irreducible conflicts or untranslatable conceptions of justice.
Excellent questions. So, as I said, I think about cultures as sets and they overlap, right? And so, the way I think about a culture of justice is in contrast with John Rawls, where John Rawls was essentially thinking that, if you're trying to create one culture, then you're going to be in conflict, with what he called the fact of reasonable pluralism, the fact that we can have very different points of view that are reasonable ways of going. Well, what I would say is that the key is about this language of reasonableness, and so the point of view I hold is not that we should be forming this one particular culture, but rather we should be proscribing, disallowing certain things that are in violation of key norms of necessary for a culture of justice. And so, in a sense, rather than prescribing one culture, the idea is saying, hey, these things are destructive of a just culture, and they should be prohibited or controlled or at least responded to affirmatively by government speech or public action of various kinds. So I guess what I'm trying to say is I don't think we should necessarily envision a totality of a singular culture where we explain what Rawls calls a comprehensive doctrine. I'm not an advocate for a particular comprehensive doctrine. But when I say striving for a culture of justice, I think of it as an ideal and aim that we're trying to achieve. And that culture is one we would beget by permitting all the varieties of reasonable and acceptable cultural differences while proscribing those which clearly hurt people. Now, there will be disagreements of it, but we have that same kind of issue across countries where we have different laws and we have overlapping expectations not to kill, not to steal, not to do certain perjure oneself across so many countries. Like that, there's a lot of things that aren't very controversial and others that are more so. And so we're going to debate and haggle over them. And let me give you an example of a problematic case to offer, which is that the Southern New Hampshire University had put out a bias-free language guide, right, in which it said, among other things, for instance, that the word American was problematic. And so I was teaching a course, Education in American Culture, and how am I going to teach this course without using the word American? It sounded implausible to figure out how to do this, right? And that bias-free language guide was taken off their website shortly thereafter. It was criticized publicly, and I do think we can kind of go too far in the other direction, clearly. But the point is not to sort of ridicule or to harshly criticize such things, but to realize people are trying, and some things work and others don't, and some things stick and keep being used. A good example of something sticking is that there was a group in I want to say Oregon, the NAACP in Oregon had asked a given public office if they would stop using the words brown bag lunch and instead use a lunch and learn. Now you might think to yourself, oh, what's the difference? What does it matter? Well, those of you aware of the brown bag test or the paper bag test know that the Cotton Club in New York City wouldn't let you in if you were darker than a brown paper bag. So there was sort of an elitism for being light brown skinned, and that sort of had some tensions racially and so on, and it's unpleasant. So anyway, my point is that that's an easy thing to change, right? And there are all kinds of. I'm sorry, I'm going to stop there, but there are all kinds of steps and ways in which we can.
All right, so we're at time for our session today. I want to thank you once again very warmly for spending time with us today and introducing your ideas. Let's hear it for Professor.
Thank you, everybody. It's my pleasure to join you, and thank you for considering these crazy ideas with me.
All right, great. All right, so we had to put off the two book reviews for today, so we'll do those. We'll do one of those next time. All right, and we'll continue with Tia Noel Pratt's book on Tuesday. Have a great weekend, please all. Eric, Ray Scott. How are things going out there? Are you easily passing this around?